Welcome to the Americanism book study. I'm Cody Leibold, and this is the 8th of our 9 meetings. We are studying a new textbook of Americanism, the politics of Ayn Rand. So this week, the reading was from pages 125 to 150. You can go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism to get the replays of all the videos. We're discussing the unique set of ideas behind the original American way of government. If you'd like to join in more upcoming discussions, I invite you to our upcoming book study, which is going to be on a new book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. That study starts January 8th, 2022. You can get the details at christianintellectual.com/objectivism, and you can sign up there. So our reading this week was 2 chapters in the Textbook of Americanism. The first is from Yaron Brook, and it's called The Textbook of Americanism Today. So he has several different sections in there where he is describing this idea of individualism versus collectivism applied to whether or not the society as a whole has a crusading ideal, and then applied to religion in politics, applied to Islamic totalitarianism, and all these other things: defense of businessmen, environmentalism, education, free speech, nationalism, immigration, free speech, all these different things. He does this so that he can ask the question, what are some of the key issues that have come up into the discussion politically today, and how would Ayn Rand most likely talk about those topics today? I think it's helpful to get all those categories in mind because those are important subjects of debate today. And so we look at individualism as applied to those. And then the other section that we read was C. Bradley Thompson's Americanism and the Spirit of Liberty. And this is a section from his book, which is, what is the name of his book? I'm spacing on it, but it's
America's Revolutionary Mind.
America's Revolutionary Mind. And it's an outstanding book. I've listened to it on audio twice already and wanted to discuss it a lot of times because it's just so much in there about what it was that the American founding fathers believed that made it so that they had to have a revolution. And that's something that the national conservatives today have no clue about. And to the extent that they've ever read the history about it, they lie about it every day. So this has a lot that we could pull from, as we're, for the most part, in this discussion, Christians looking to bring in the ideas of the founding fathers and some of the political ideas of Ayn Rand into the discussion today. So let's go ahead and collect some questions or some ideas for topics, and then we'll work through that, and we'll have about an hour of discussion today. Any suggestions for topics to cover?
I have a couple that are kind of different prongs of the same topic. So there's a couple different things, but they're all connected. And they mostly have to do with Thompson's chapter in the textbook. First, he mentions that even though there are distinctly American folkways, is the word he used, just like every country has, as opposed to where you wouldn't have anything that you could call Frenchism or Persianism. We do have Americanism, and there is a distinctly American philosophy. I was saying, I think it was Yoram Hazony's son actually on Twitter was saying, the free market is a cultural artifact, just like religion and art, etc. So those are two very different views. So one is that, we have this idea of the free market and capitalism at the center, and we all, these peripheral cultural ideas that could come and go without changing the essence of America. Whereas Hazony's son, I think, was saying the free market is just one of many different cultural artifacts, and it's good, but it's only as good as we appreciate our culture. And so this idea that and this is kind of a second prong of what I'm saying, but it's very closely related. This idea that Americanism and being American is fundamentally an idea rather than just a heritage, merely things that we inherit, things that we do just because they're our culture, and you could have another culture that would be just equally valuable. That idea has been one of the biggest targets of kind of the new conservatism, kind of the new national conservatism. They say, if you think Americanism is an idea, then you're being exploited by those globalists who want to use your universal principles against you, and you're just a sucker. We're not an idea, we're a people. And So maybe we could talk about that idea and why we don't think that's a weakness, why we don't think that it's bad to say that Americanism is an idea, and maybe respond to some of those common objections.
Thanks for bringing that one. Other objections, comments, and questions? We'll list them out first, and then eventually we'll get through them and discuss them. There was a discussion that Jacob Brenton and I had just over Messenger about this term Americanism and its utility for describing the difference between what we're advocating. And this is a common point that we have with the objectivists, the Ayn Rand Institute, for example. We would all say that we advocate this Americanism idea of government and not conservatism and not, for instance, progressivism or the moderation or anything like that. We're radicals for Americanism. And a related term is individualism. And I think that somewhere in one of these chapters, it might have been Greg Salmieri pointed out that we could call the United States an individualistic republic or something like that, because it's the idea of individual rights is the purpose of the government, and we have a republic to uphold it. So individualism applied in the social sphere and in terms of law, that would be Americanism. All right, well, I don't see any other comments coming in or topics. Oh, Jacob, go ahead.
I would love to just talk some about the end of Bradley's chapter, or Bradley Thompson's chapter, where he's talking about Americanism in practice. He's got some really great stuff there about the American frontier and the rugged individualism of the American West, and how that worked out this idea of individualism in practice, and how it sort of forced early American men on the frontier to develop the values of individualism and self-governance that we've kind of lost today because of the pamperedness that you might say we have in society. And so, and I really like that, because there are certain elements of popular conservatism today that want to harken back to sort of a rugged frontier mindset, but they do it in a very collectivistic way. And so I think Bradley, or Thompson, does a really good job of showing how, no, that's actually part and parcel of individualism. So I think that'd be good to cover too.
Well, let's start with that topic, Jacob, because that actually segues nicely into the ones that Andrew brought up, because they're the consequence of analyzing that. So, Jacob, was there more that you wanted to say about that idea to begin with, or you want me to jump in?
I just want to, I'll read a few quotes of his here. So he says, "The code of rugged individualism was a social fact, not some idealized myth. It began with a man, his axe, and his gun. American pioneers did not have Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, Social Security, food stamps, public housing, government schools, Amtrak. Shockingly, at least to us in the 21st century, they lived their lives free of meddling government officers, inspectors, regulators, teachers, and social workers. They cleared the land, they built homes, factories, hospitals, stores, roads, bridges, ships, schools, universities, opera houses, museums, and all other assets of a developing industrial nation. And they did it without the approval or assistance of government bureaucrats." Like that is just, it's a really glorious picture of individualism applied in action, and just looking back and seeing, yeah, you can do all those things without a heavy government regulatory state, or without these collectivistic ideals of social good. But then he also talks about some other things. I won't read all the quotes about Erland here, about developing personal responsibility, because no one else is there. Like, there's no safety net. So you are judged by your ability to create your own values, to sustain your own life, and then to produce abundance so that it overflowed into helping others and building other things that also benefited the rest of the community.
The safety net is a distinction that Americanism would not say that there should be a government safety net. That's something that we're going to draw a distinction between ourselves and the conservatives, because most people that are within the GOP today, even Ronald Reagan, advocated the idea of there being a government safety net for some situations. So, we take Reagan to be the exemplar of conservatism, but he's not really. And if you talk to any of the college professors at Boyce College or Southern Seminary, they're all going to believe that there should be a social safety net in the form of the government. And the biggest, I would say one of the biggest themes that comes out in Bradley's chapter here is Thompson's chapter, is that he says the American individualists, they thought and judged independently, and they acted without the permission of others. And that there's such a difference between, a nation where you have to have permission in order to do something, versus a nation like what we had, and what has been lost. And it's just progressed over time, and in different states it's been different. I remember hearing, from my aunt who lived in Arizona one time. She says, well, in some states, like in Arizona, you just assume that you can do it unless there's a law that says you can't. But like in California, you assume that you can't do it unless there's like a law or regulation that says that you can. And this is just a different approach, a different mindset, and that leads to eventually, actually, if you go to, if you were reading the beginning of your own Brooks chapter, he describes how after World War II, in the Western countries, it just came to be the assumption that we're going to have a mixed economy, that there's going to be a mix between some collective aspects and some free market aspects. I mean, what does it mean when you say some freedom? Like, what does that even mean? But the trouble there is this worldview has, it's just so permeated where we can hardly even imagine what it would be like if the government was just leaving people alone and letting them do their business and work with who they want and sell what they want. It's almost unthinkable. And you read this chapter from Thompson, and it's startling to realize, the frontier was this place where people developed this mindset out of necessity, but they also moved to the frontier because they wanted that. They knew what they were getting into when they moved out there. They wanted to be further away from the bureaucrats. That's because they understood that was the key to having a flourishing life. So it's interesting to think about the historical, the causality sequence there. I believe that the thing that mainly moves history is what people have believed to be true, the ideas that they've accepted. So that sort of is a segue into what Andrew was saying about there are different approaches to this idea of what is Americanism. And the national conservatives today would say the United States, the citizens of America, they are people. They are a people, and they spring mostly from England and other Western European countries, and they brought with them certain ideas about law and about what should be the rights and what shouldn't be, and we're just a natural continuation. I think that in the debate from your own book, and was it Yaram Hazoni is his name? That was one of the topics that came up, because the national conservatives would want to say there's a continuity here between the values of England and of the United States. There wasn't necessarily an American Revolution because the Americans had a revolution in their ideology. They would say there was just an American Revolution because there was a tyrant in England who wasn't following the ideology that everybody in England and in the Americas already had been living according to, for centuries. And I mean, if you've read C. Bradley Thompson's book, you'll understand that's not the case. There actually was a revolution, although this is what kind of revolution it was. It was a revolution of identifying contradictions and then eliminating them. So the way that the legal system was in Great Britain at the time of the American Revolution, it was one of the most rights-respecting countries in the world. And so once those principles of the rule of law, and you don't have taxation without representation, and these other kinds of things, once they were accepted, then the people in the Americas began to ask themselves, what is the logical implication of this? And then when there was any overstep of the rights that they had already come to accept as theirs, they were willing to fight back, even if it was only on a very, very small tax, because you can't set a precedent. Once somebody starts taxing you at 1%, they're going to be taxing you at 1.5% a year from now. You know that that's true, and you can see that in the history of the United States. So they recognized that this was going to happen, and they said, no, we have to fight back because there has been a change in our understanding of the purpose of government, and there's been a change in our understanding of what legitimizes the government. And we can make a good case from that if you look in Thompson's book. So Andrew, that brings me to your question, which was, okay, so what about the national conservatives today who are saying Americanism shouldn't be an idea? Let's make sure that we're representing them adequately. I mean, I have friends that identify with this view. So Andrew, why don't you give us your best attempt at making their idea look good?
All right. So the people, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So this is usually what you'll hear. Classical liberalism says that Americanism or America is just an idea, but every other country gets to be a people, and they get to have borders, and they get to have distinctiveness to their culture. But we have to be a big melting pot and invite everyone, all these immigrants and all these people from the third world, to come and take away our heritage and ruin all the good things that we have, that our ancestors have built for us. And you people who say that America is just an idea, you're the ones who are giving license to that. You're giving license to these globalists because you're saying we're just an idea, we're not a people, how dare you? And then that's also when you get into and that's the end of my quote. And you'll also, it kind of goes hand in hand with the idea that I don't think these people are white nationalists at all. Most of the people that we're talking about here, but they will say, hey, isn't it wrong that every other race or every other like ethnicity gets to have their own sort of coalition, but like white people don't get to do that. And it's true, there, like we've talked about on the Nazism chapter, it is true that there is a lot of like, villainization of the white man today, and we all recognize that. But do you see how this kind of goes hand in hand? Like, if Americanism is just an idea, then what you're saying is white people don't get to have a country, and so that's a common attack. It goes a little bit hand in hand as well with those who kind of disfavor immigration.
Yeah, I would add right there that the national conservatives are critiquing people that believe in the vision of the founding fathers and this idea of Americanism as an idea. And they're critiquing us by saying that we are fundamentally similar to the leftist progressives. And the way that we're fundamentally similar is that we've embraced an idea and turned an abstraction into the definition for who we should be as a country and what our North Star should be. And, if you phrase it that way, it's kind of interesting to think about. Like, so are you saying that you shouldn't use abstractions as your idea of your vision for what the country should be? Like, I mean, you can choose your abstraction, we can debate it. Like, let's talk about justice as an abstraction. That's an abstraction, right? Or liberty or freedom could be abstractions that people would use to organize a nation. Individual rights could be one. But what they're going to do is say, oh, you guys, you believe in individualism. And individualism makes you like the radical progressives, because the common theme that we see in the radical progressives, the leftists, and those of you who call yourselves classical liberals or Americanism advocates, this common theme is that you believe that people do not have responsibilities to the collective. And the way that is going to manifest is some people think that they can marry whoever they want, they can do whatever sexual behavior they want. Other people are going to think, you can sit a toddler on your lap and dress like a drag queen, and that's individualism. And then other people are going to say, well, individualism is that you don't have to pay any taxes. And they're going to lump those two ideas together. Jacob, I saw you'd raise your hand.
Yeah, let me first respond to Andrew's question. So, because there's the equivocation between us saying America or Americanism is an idea, and that getting equivocated with the leftist ideology. And then there's also the issue of individualism and that being equivocated with subjectivism. So let me first talk about the first topic of whether or not America is an idea, and whether if we do say America is an idea, that means that we're guilty of all the things that Andrew was saying we would be guilty of. He doesn't actually believe that. He's representing that position. So it's not just that it's like the national conservative who says that, right, is saying, if you think that America is an idea, no matter what idea it is, then everything else follows, and you're no different from a leftist. And it's like, well, hold on. The mere fact that we both agree that it's an idea doesn't mean that all of those things follow, right? The bad things follow from leftism, not because leftists think America is an idea, but because of the idea that they think America is. The idea that they think America is this altruistic, irrational, postmodern, subjectivistic, nihilistic, egalitarian, communist utopia, right? That's what they think America is. That's the idea. So the idea itself is completely antithetical. It's the exact opposite on almost every issue from what we think America as an idea is. So it's just absurd to say that everything would follow from our idea of America that follows from the leftist idea of America merely because they're both ideas. Like that, it's just an absolute fallacy. It's just stupid. But then there's the objection of, why is it that every other racial group gets to have their own racialized country or their own, little racialized nation? Gets to, why would I see that as a privilege? What, like, it's an achievement that we have risen above that because we're not barnyard animals. It's an achievement that we think like men, using ideas and values that we have in common with people, regardless of what they look like. And that those are the things that unite us, rather than, oh, he happens to look like me, so I like him, and he happens not to look like me, so I don't like him. How stupid, how base, how animalistic, how materialistic, right? And most of these guys are Christians. So it's very, very absurd at every point. It holds no water, and we could go into deeper aspects of it. But I mean, if you stop to think about it for more than 2 seconds, it just, all of their arguments are nothing.
The debate between Hazony and Brooke couldn't be possible unless we had the benefit of people moving from other countries to our country because they believed in ideals. And in the case of both of them, this is a benefit to our country to have intelligent people that believe in something move to our country. Like, I mean, yeah, just to bring up the whole topic of immigration, the biggest irony is when people would say to Ayn Rand, like, how can you believe in immigration? And she says, are you dropping some context in her thick Russian accent? All right. So let's go ahead. Ryan, I saw you had your hand raised. What was it you wanted to add there?
Yeah, perhaps I'm misunderstanding the debate, but I wonder if perhaps there's either just misunderstanding or a shell game happening here with with the interlocutors that Andrew described, where while we in discussing in promoting Americanism are attempting to prescribe something for the nation, that these are ideas and a philosophy that we highly recommend, that we hope will characterize our nation in a way that it does not today, in a more significant way in the future. I think perhaps the shell game happening is they're saying, well, if you're going to define our nation, they're interpreting us or portraying us as describing, as instead of prescribing, but describing the nation by an idea. And we're saying we're not denying the fact that the nation can, that part of defining what America is a country with borders that are defensible and occupies a particular place on the map and all of that stuff. Certain individuals are citizens and others are not. Of course, all of that. What we're discussing is what is the view of governance and personal responsibility and other philosophical matters that should be held by Americans. And so I think we should clarify we're prescribing something here. We hope someday to be able to describe America as a place where most people hold these ideas. But right now we are prescribing this philosophy, and don't try to play that shell game and say, therefore, if we are prescribing certain ideas, that means we have to, for some reason, jettison any of the defensible fundamental characteristics of being a nation. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, one of the critiques that I hear from those traditionalist conservatives or national conservatives has been that if you try to make America an idea, then there won't be a definition of for instance, if America is just an idea, then we should have open borders. Is one criticism that I've heard, and there's one thing that I see within the national conservatives that is a benefit, that is a good quality, is that they are looking at the tendency of the progressive leftists to turn America into the Santa Claus for the whole world, giving handouts to everybody. And they're saying, wait a minute, shouldn't we care first about our own people? And shouldn't the role of the American government be to defend the Americans' lives, not other people's lives necessarily? And so that's correct. But then that's a conclusion. But what matters is the method by which they got there. And we believe that if we're an advocate of Americanism, someone like myself, we believe that the purpose of that government is to protect the people within its borders, to protect their individual rights. But we don't do it on the basis of, because they're closer. We do it on the basis because that is what a government is. Now, there was something that you mentioned earlier, Ryan, about the whether Americanism is descriptive or prescriptive. I think that currently it's not very descriptive of our country. I think that if you check out the Thompson chapter, it was more descriptive. And this is one of our useful rhetorical angles as we're trying to advocate for what seems very radical to most people, is we can say, actually, we believe what the founding fathers believed. And especially since we're Christians, they're just going to point this out. It's not all that great rhetorically for me to say, hey, read this atheist. She'll tell you how to be a better Christian. And now I actually believe that. I believe that if most people would read Ayn Rand, they would have a more Christian political theology by the end of it. But it's probably better rhetorically in most situations for me to say, you should go back and read the Federalist Papers. You should read the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. You should consider what the founding fathers said, and try not to get into debates about whether this or that founding father would agree with this or that national conservative, because that is a distraction. The question, though, is what was the principle that made the United States distinct from the countries that existed in history before that? And if you don't believe that there is any principle that makes it distinct, you have to ask yourself, why do we have so much evidence that the United States was a different kind of a thing and that it led a different direction? Is it really just because of our gene pool? Like, really, is that your argument, that our gene pool made that happen? Why didn't it happen in Germany and England and Ireland and Sweden? And for that matter, why is the kind of Western civilization flourishing happening in South Korea, but not North Korea? You understand, it's not a gene issue. I had one other thing I wanted to loop back to with this is something from Andrew's question. He had said, is the free market just a cultural product? Andrew, you want to elaborate on that? What is the question there?
Yeah, and I'll also use this as an opportunity to loop in an example from yesterday from the Supreme Court. And I'll use this to illustrate, and then I'll give the broader principle. So let me premise this by saying that if all 9 justices on the Supreme Court were all Clarence Thomas, this country would be a much better place. That being said, here is where I see a weakness and part of his judicial philosophy. And this illustrates this exact point. This is from an opinion that came down yesterday. He says, as we have explained elsewhere, a federal court's jurisdiction in equity, which is just a technical term, extends no further than, quote, the jurisdiction in equity exercised by the High Court of Chancery in England at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the enactment of the original Judiciary Act. So Clarence Thomas has a lot of judicial ideas that we would agree with, but his justification is, this is what was in place at the time at the High Court of Chancery in England at the time that the Constitution was adopted. And that illustrates this idea that, and this would go for free markets as well, as I originally mentioned, but all of these principles of government are seen as, this has worked better than anything else. You'll hear the phrase trial and error a lot. And trial and error is a great thing. And Yaron Brook mentioned that. He said, we've learned from history. We do get things from history, but we extrapolate principles from history. We don't just say, these are the concretes that have worked. Let's just stop right here. We've progressed and progressed and progressed, and this happened to work. Rather than digging in and say, what was it about that? What were the concepts in there that made it work? So to clarify, one of you says, there's nothing inherently better or worse about one culture or another. It's good to stick with the culture you grew up in. But we can see that certain cultures, we can't deny that certain cultures have had better outcomes. So let's just pick what has worked for us and stick with that. Whereas our view is, we agree we can look at history and see which ideas and which cultures have produced good outcomes, but let's extrapolate philosophical principles from that. That helps us sort out the good from the bad in those historical examples, better than just picking a year and saying, whatever was acceptable in this year, like Clarence Thomas was saying, that's what we're going to stick with now. And I hope that illustrates the difference. Hazoni's son was basically saying, the free market is great, but it's good in the same way that classical music from Europe is good, or that, Shakespeare is good. It's good because we happen to have it and it's worked for us, and it's our heritage, as opposed to, it is our heritage, but we need to stick to it because philosophically it's robust.
It's the difference between having a principle versus just being a moral relativist and saying, well, this is just your political preference, or this is a benefit or a perk. But it's not something that we would say it must be the case morally. Jacob, I saw you raise your hand.
The absolute outrageous moral relativism of these guys, especially when they claim to be Christian, a lot of them, is just astounding. Like, take a moment to think about if they treated some serious moral issue the same way they treat politics, which is also a serious moral issue. But it's like, in their minds, there are serious moral issues, because they're probably pietists deep down, that pertain to personal piety. And then there are the unserious moral issues like politics and culture, where it's okay to just do this trial and error bull crap, right? But imagine if they did this trial and error dance with something like adultery. Like, well, imagine that they argued, well, there are cultures where adultery has worked. It's been, they've gone through trial and error, and it worked for them. And we shouldn't impose these theoretical abstractions on people and make them abandon centuries of the trial and error that has worked for them. And then think about, how do you find what works? The mere fact that something's been around for a long time, that they seem to assume means that it has worked. But otherwise, if you say, well, no, even if it has been around a long time, but with disastrous consequences, then you're imposing a theoretical abstract principle on it by judging it as disastrous rather than good. Where are you getting that standard? But by what standard are you determining that this centuries-long practice has disastrous outcomes? What do you mean by disastrous? You can't answer that without appealing to the types of principles that they say are out of bounds, right? And then imagine if you treated Christianity this way. Well, the Germanic people had centuries of success with their tribalistic pagan deities. And, it's okay to add Christ to that pantheon of deities. But why should we impose this abstract, theoretical, monotheistic religion, this novel, monotheistic Trinitarian religion, upon the Germanic peoples, for whom their pagan worship has worked just fine through trial and error for centuries? It's just absolutely ridiculous. There is no justification for it. It is the stupidest line of reasoning that no one would accept on any other issue. They just carve out this exception for politics and culture for some reason.
Ryan, I saw you had your hand raised too.
Yeah, I completely agree, Jacob. Speaking of the Germanic peoples, the opponents you're speaking of would have completely opposed Boniface chopping down the oak of Thor. This is as long as they, speaking of shell games, it's what's happening. They slap culture on it, and suddenly it becomes completely unable to be critiqued. It's off limits. That's something you can't touch with your with any critique, with any judgment whatsoever, because it's their culture, as if what all of society believes or what you've been taught is an untouchable ideal. When
Just like with the left,
what was that?
said just like with the leftists.
Exactly, and right after George Floyd's death, a lot of discussion was happening online, and I believe it was in the context of the gospel and the social justice statement that came out, which is a document I'm not a huge fan of, but I appreciate the gesture and the work that went into that, and I think it started a necessary conversation. Nevertheless, there's a line in there that speaks about some cultures being more or less moral than others. And that was a particular sticking point with some of my progressive friends. I would call them friends. I don't know if they would call me the same anymore, but they said, how dare you? How dare you criticize another person's culture and say that one could be better than another? When literally in their previous comment, they had just critiqued white America as a culture. And I pointed this out and said to them, what I wrote in I was just reminded by that I'll get to what I said to them, but I was reminded by that whole interchange in on page, 129, where Yarn Brooks says, what's more, Americans have been victimized by a particularly virulent form of collectivism, multiculturalism, which teaches us to regard all cultures as equal. We cannot oppose murderous Islamists because we are no better than they are. He then quotes Peikoff and says, multiculturalism is an assault on our national self-esteem, an initiative of unprecedented proportions. Are we any better, many educated Americans today ask, than the cultures who hate us? Don't they have a right to their ideas and values too? Do you see how we can be the world's only superpower and nevertheless be unable properly to fight our enemies? Fearsome weaponry is of no value if the man with his finger on the button cannot bring himself or his countrymen to make the decision to push it. And in the margins here, I just wrote culture as worldview expressed versus culture as preferences. Because I think the shell game that's being played with some of our interlocutors is that we say, yeah, some cultures are worse than others. Look at that culture that has protected and elevated cannibalism to such an extent that it now characterizes that culture. Obviously, it is more evil than in a non-cannibalistic culture where it is not only abhorred, but punished. I think everyone would agree with that. At least I hope so. Maybe not in the debate, but at the end of the day, if they saw someone committing cannibalism, they would react with horror. The problem is, I think what they are doing is when they are criticizing us for comparing cultures, they're defining culture as essentially preferences, as if we are critiquing the use of garlic in Italian cuisine. How dare you make a moral judgment about that? That's the culture as preference being used, which is essentially, I think that's what a lot of lay people who don't have these discussions think of when they think of culture. They think of music. They think of the culinary arts. They think of film and those kinds of, less philosophical. I shouldn't say less philosophical, but they are. I think my examples will suffice there. But what we're discussing is culture as worldview expressed in society. And clearly, we would all here believe that sins, as we as Christians would describe them, can be elevated to such an extent within a society that it begins to characterize that culture. And thus that culture can be critiqued on those grounds.
Yeah, you can discuss culture on the level of whether there is a moral standard for example, telling the truth. Some cultures have a different idea of what telling the truth requires, and there's different conceptions of any moral category. Yeah, I agree with you. And then I would add something that Jacob has done a good job of describing in the past, was that there is this conception of determinism that says that your culture is based on your genes. And if people have bought into that, then of course it's quite rude and offensive to say, well, that this culture is better than another, because then what that means is that my genes are better than your genes or something like that. But yeah, if you want to, in a debate, if you want to just stop the debate all of a sudden, just ask, is Islam right about women? The multiculturalists cannot answer that question. Isaac, I saw you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Brian's saying. He's making a good point that when we try to critique culture, it's as if it's all put on the same scale and it's just preferences. And there's definitely a distinction that needs to be made between the characteristics of culture that are the art, the food, the customs. Customs might be starting to get into the other part of what we mean by when we talk about culture. But specifically those first two things like art and food, those are very beautiful things that we can look at all kinds of cultures throughout the world and say, yes, I mean, this is part of God's creation, that people are made differently, and people come up with different ideas, and they celebrate different things, and they create different things. And this is a beautiful thing. And that's one aspect of culture, but we need to make this distinction towards the other part of culture that's more like, you could probably put custom in there, practices, ideas, things of that nature that would fall under a moral character judgment. And the only observation I wanted to make on top of what Ryan was saying with regards to that is, it seems like the only culture we're allowed to criticize is America. All other cultures are off the table. Only America, and you even see that in the evangelical world. People always would be like, well, that's a very Western, view of justice or something like that. And it's like, you're not supposed to have, if you talk about justice and it, smells like Western justice, that's not a good thing. You need to broaden your horizons. Yeah.
All right, thanks for that. Comments on that before we move forward? All right,
I could just add briefly in response to what Jacob said there about the what our critics say about culture being off limits from critique, essentially being a view, an essentialist view, saying that these cultures are essentially just an expression of their genes. That's rarely said outright. But yet, when you see the Smithsonian putting out documents that say white supremacism can be seen in the cultural value of being polite, how do you not conclude from that what they're saying is that is a completely relative concept that should not be promoted whatsoever? And if you're not white, that's probably not something you grew up with, and that's fine, or even that's just not something that you naturally want to do. If you read that list, you can't come away with that without thinking, how does this not end up promoting traditional racism in the United States? How is that not the logical conclusion of that, concluding that being on time and being polite and hard work is something that is fundamentally not part of non-white, the nature of non-white people, which is a disgusting idea. And yet that is the fundamental conclusion you would be drawn to by reading some of those resources coming out by America's institutions paid for by our tax dollars.
That is similar to what the Oregon Governor Kate Brown is doing. She signed a bill removing reading, writing, and math requirements for high school kids, quote, to help students of color. I mean, it's like that stupid thing Joe Biden said, like something about how poor kids are just as smart as white kids. And he's like, oh my goodness. I don't remember if that was the exact quote, but it's like, do you really think that that's the way the world works? All right. There's something that Jacob shared with me, a definition of Americanism, and I'd like to read it. Americanism is the political philosophy which affirms that the state is a necessary good designed to govern over a delimited geographical area with sole responsibility of securing the inalienable individual rights of those under its proper jurisdiction. Those inalienable individual rights which the state is responsible for securing are life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. These rights are recognized, not granted by the state, as rights which are inherent to every man, derived not by permission but by human nature, and are secured by the state against all who would violate them, both foreign and domestic. He goes on, the state has the solemn responsibility to protect and secure the aforementioned inalienable individual rights of those under its jurisdiction against all foreign threats by means of a sufficiently vibrant military, designed to utterly decimate any existential threat to those rights, such that all foreign actors would tremble at the thought of threatening the people protected by the state, their rights, and the state's ability to secure those rights. And lastly, the state also has the solemn responsibility to protect and secure the aforementioned inalienable individual rights of those under its jurisdiction against all domestic threats, whether by individuals, groups, or internal civil governing bodies. This domestic responsibility must be accomplished through clear and objective laws implemented in an objective and impartial manner. And then Jacob also commented that he thought that would sufficiently distinguish what we're saying is Americanism versus the libertarian perspective. So far in the discussion today, we've described the leftist progressives, the moderates, the national conservatives, those who believe in Americanism, but also we should contrast ourselves to the libertarians because there is a strong movement, and in Yaron Brooks' chapter, he has something about that there is a move toward rejecting the idea that the government is a necessary good and calling the government a necessary evil. Now, we believe that the people should watch the government and not vice versa. We believe that the government reports to us. We believe that there's enormous danger in giving government power. That does not mean that we think that government itself is an evil. We think it is a good, and especially when it comes to the ability to use weapons of war and marshal an army and those kinds of things. We disagree with the libertarians for the most part. And we absolutely reject the anarcho-capitalist idea. So I point that out because as we're defining this idea of Americanism, we are going to have people who are in the social conservative camp who are going to agree with us because they have been reading their Bibles. But a topic that comes up is, should we argue the Bible says it, therefore that's the right political view? And should that be our only argument? Should we also be willing to make arguments from natural law? And perhaps is one of them the starting point? And my conclusion is that the arguments from natural law are the starting point. The kinds of things that the government should do are known to all peoples, Christian or pagan. And we should be able to argue what the purpose of the government is on the basis of natural observations. And that's the way that John Locke proceeded, even though he was a devoted Christian. And it's on the basis of a lot of John Locke's ideas about just observing philosophically, what is a man? What does it take to live? What is required? That you get to the idea of individual rights. And so when I read, there are social conservatives that are very good on these issues, saying that the government should only be used to prevent people from murder and from kidnapping and from theft and these kinds of things. And if they made a list of all the things they thought the government should do, their list and mine would probably align 95%, 99%. There might be some disagreements about whether to outlaw pornography or drugs, and that's about it. But the method by which they reach that conclusion is going to alter who they're willing to ally themselves with. It's going to alter who they're willing to tolerate within their movement, and it's going to change the kinds of arguments that they make. So I would say a principle to take away from that is be willing to use good arguments from the Bible to political principles, especially to make a case that the Founding Fathers' view of government is consistent with, necessitated by what we find in Scripture, to show those who are Christians, who are skeptical about our claims about politics and political theology, to show them that they would be in error if they didn't follow the way that we're saying. But arguing straight from the Bible to politics is not the only argument that we have available, and it's perhaps not the most persuasive argument that we have available, because anybody, as if you've ever listened to Russell Moore speak for more than 5 minutes, anybody can make the Bible say anything if they're not using common sense and honesty. And one of the easiest ways that you can combat that is by pointing out that by natural law itself and by the consequences that we know through history, there are certain standards for what the government should and should not be doing. And we are going to use natural revelation as well as the special revelation of Scripture as Christians. We're going to use every argument that we can. Jacob, I saw you had a comment.
Yeah, along those lines, I would say the Bible gives us many concrete things that the government ought to do, and sometimes also concrete things that the government ought not to do. But it doesn't typically give us the rationale behind those things, other than God says so, right? So, and it certainly doesn't give us a political theory or a political philosophy. It doesn't intend to, and that's fine. That's not a deficiency in Scripture. It's just that's not the focus of Scripture. To get the rationale, and especially the integrated, systematic, all-encompassing rationale that is a whole political philosophy, you have to get that from natural law and natural theology through studying the nature of the things that God has created, in particular, man's nature and the nature of the state as an agent of force, right? So you can get discrete, concrete pieces of information from Scripture, but you can't do the whole integrated, systematized philosophy that you need for an entire view of politics apart from using natural law.
All right, thanks for that. Isaac, I saw your hand raised.
I want to expound on what Jacob's saying here and just kind of like speak to the person who might be thinking, why is understanding the rationale important? Why isn't it just enough that God said, right? If God said, then boom, end of discussion. Why is knowing the rationale important? And Jacob kind of spoke to this. I had an analogy that popped in my head. When I was in college, I took a chemistry test and I had a question about like ionization energies, and it was like, is this chemical, is it higher or lower than this other ionization energy? And there's this, what you're taught in chemistry is that the energies increase. Like if you're looking at the periodic table, there's this rule that they increase as you go from left to right. And so, the two chemicals that you were given, which is this one higher or lower than the other one? It was on the left side. So the answer should have been, according to that rule, if it's on the left side, then if it increases from left to right, then it's lower. But I knew what I understood that at a deeper level about how when electrons, the way that they're ordered, if there's an even amount of electrons, then that rule can actually be broken and you'll have a higher energy, even if it's on the left side. And the chemicals that were in question was this special one that had an even amount of electrons. So even though the rule was that from left to right, it increases, the one that was in question had the special configuration of electrons such that it actually broke that rule. And so when I read this question, I'm like, it's a trick question. I know that, this is the specific one that breaks that rule. So I chose that one. When I got the test back, they said it was wrong. And I went up to the professor and I said, I don't think that this is wrong. I know that there's a general rule that increases from left to right, but like actually look at the actual energies and you'll see that this one's lower. We talked about it and they said, you're right. And they ended up sending out a whole email to the whole class saying, everybody gets that question because we didn't realize that it was flawed. So all of that to say, that's why it's important to understand the rationale behind things, to understand things at a more fundamental, deeper level, because when you do that, you actually begin to see and make better decisions about specific cases.
I appreciate that. So that's something that you can apply when you are reading Twitter and you're seeing various people who identify as national conservatives or as nationalists or conservatives in different ways. And you can ask yourself, what principle is this person using? And there's a huge difference between those national conservatives, because there's lots of variety in that camp. There are some of them who are going to say, we believe in natural rights. And there are some who are going to say, we believe that the overarching principle there is going to be the common good. And when those two start talking, they're going to eventually realize that they are on different sides of that issue and that there cannot be a cohesive movement if you've got some people that say there are such things as individual rights and some people who say there are not. Now, what you believe the application should be once you've accepted the principle, there can be lots of disagreements about. But if your approach is intentionally seeking the principle, I believe those who seek it will find it. And I believe that that principle is going to be individual rights. And that's going to be the basis for the kind of political movement that we need to create in the United States. So get to know the people and get to know whether or not they are honest. Sadly, for the most part, conservatism as a movement is not honest. It is tribalistic, and it is making use of whatever arguments are necessary in order to just prove that their foregone conclusion is correct. Perhaps a form of presuppositionalism, I would say. There is a huge encouragement to be found in being able to find other people who want to talk about the same topics and that believe certain things. So if you're watching on YouTube, give this a like. That's going to help the message spread to more people. Share it with somebody. Give it a share on social media, or even just send it to somebody by text message, because we're at a fairly small stage in building our audience right now. And we're at the stage where if we get to know people, we can actually invest in them, talk to them on the phone, and bring them on video like this. So it's a neat stage in development. It's not always going to be this way. But if you want to get in on the ground floor, become part of this discussion, potentially it's going to lead to us putting together online events and in-person events where you are the presenter. That's an opportunity that I want to mention to you for the upcoming book study on the Objectivism book. You can find the details there at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. There, the people that are watching right now and the people that will watch it on YouTube later, if you're interested in presenting some of your ideas, talk to me ahead of time, because we have space for that. That's what this is for. We want this to be a chance for you to develop your philosophical skills and your presenting skills. So you can find that at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. We have one more week in this Americanism study, and so I will see you next Saturday at 9 a.m. Eastern. Thank you for watching today. God bless.